Although it starts off with the word Halloween, I'm only going to say a few words about Halloween, and the reason for that will become obvious. I'm not going to say much about Halloween. Most of what I'm going to be saying is about witchcraft and related phenomena. So, if we start off with Halloween, one theory holds that many Halloween traditions were influenced by Celtic harvest festivals, particularly the Gaelic festival of Samhain, which was Christianized as All Hallows Day. In the Anglican and Roman Catholic churches, the 1st of November is now All Saints' Day, and the 2nd of November is All Souls' Day. The dead were commemorated at the beginning of winter, a time of dying in nature. The souls of the dead were said to revisit their homes, and places were set to welcome them. We've largely forgotten that now, though devotees of the church may well celebrate these days, 1st and 2nd of November. Most of us have forgotten what the purpose was. And somehow we've got fixated with witches. That wasn't the initial connection. And some countries, particularly Mexico, they do celebrate the 31st of October in a big way, the Day of the Dead, the following day, which they take very seriously. And I happened to be in Mexico one Halloween, and people dress up in, when I say spooky, skeletal outfits. No witches to be seen. It's not witches, it's in this celebration. It's the images of the dead. And they dress up in the processions down the street, all very colorful. But in the houses, they set up shrines to commemorate the dead. And clearly, this poor household, a child has died, and this is being celebrated. So this is what Halloween was. It was All Hallows Eve, the day before All Hallows Day. And we've tended to forget that. Getting back to Scotland, Samhain marked the end of the harvest season and the beginning of winter. Bonfires were lit, and the flames, smoke, and ashes were deemed to have cleansing powers. It is suggested that the fires mimicked the sun and held back the decay and darkness of winter. For some nonconformist Protestants, Halloween ghosts were thought to be evil spirits, and the devil was not far away, and witches were agents of the devil. This is very important. This is one of the links between Halloween and witches. As I said, if it's just the Day of the Dead, then it's the spirits of the dead who come around. But Protestants, some felt that these were evil spirits because good spirits should be in heaven. They should not be wandering around. So if there are spirits, they are evil spirits, and evil spirits will be with the devil, and the witches were agents of the devil. So I think this is how witchcraft became, or witches became bolted on to Halloween. In any event, barns and homes were blessed to protect people and livestock from the effect of witches, who were believed to accompany the malignant spirits as they traveled the earth. From at least the 16th century, Halloween included mumming and guising. Oh, sorry, I missed a bit at the top. Bonfires were lit in flames and smoke and ashes. The fires mimicked the sun and held back the decay. From at least the 16th century, Halloween included mumming and guising. It may have originally been a tradition whereby people impersonated the souls of the dead and received offerings on their behalf. So this rather amazing photograph taken in Shetland 100 years ago shows children probably dressed up in other clothes and other people's clothes. This one's inside a sheepskin, and they're wearing painted masks. I can remember doing exactly this when I was a child. On Halloween, we would dress up, usually swapping clothes with each other, turning coats back to front, a paper mask, which I made and painted, and you went round the houses with your turnip lantern. And the initial idea was a bit of the fire kept the evil spirits at bay. And today, it's all very different. The turnip lantern's been replaced by the pumpkin lantern, because as James has discovered, cutting a pumpkin is much easier than trying to do a big turnip. But this lantern is made of plastic, this boy's lantern, so it's not going to be very good for a candle in it. 3 of them are wearing witches' hats. This girl has got a devil's horns. This one's got a bat on her head. And this girl, a pumpkin lantern, has become a bucket for taking home the treats. So it has all changed immensely. But this is what we're seeing today for Halloween. Nothing really to do with the old Halloween. Anyway, back to witches and witchcraft. These are some of the headings I'll be looking at tonight, very briefly at the paganism and Catholicism and the Reformation, then three important books here we will need to quickly discuss, and that led to the witch trials. And then we'll look at material evidence of witchcraft and anti-witchcraft and end up very briefly with modern witches. Our idea of witches is heavily coloured by Shakespeare's Macbeth. If anybody think of witches, they immediately think of three witches round a cauldron. And these images have been created and disseminated many times. But these images are not contemporary. They're all later than Shakespeare. But we all know the scene, the three witches meeting Macbeth, and we get double, double, toil and trouble, and the first witch, and this lovely rhyming couplets, eye of newt and toe of frog, wool of bat and tongue of dog, and so forth. I'm sure we all learned that at school. So our concept of witches is very much what is seen through Shakespeare. But what is a witch? Historically, a person, traditionally a woman, believed to have magical abilities and to use supernatural powers. Some people believe that witchcraft is a surviving pagan religion, but that has been challenged by academics. Some people said it had been with us since pagan times, but that has been challenged. A woman called Margaret Murray, she was the proponent of it being a pagan religion, but there's been strong evidence against that. An interesting point is there is no common word for witch in European languages. The English word witch comes from the Anglo-Saxon witche for a female witch and wicca for a male witch. About 10 to 15% of witches were male. But in other languages, they don't use the word wicca or witche, which some people have said has been related to the word wicked, but other people disagree with that. In French, the word is sorcière. In Spanish, it's bruja. In Italian, it's strega. In German, it's hexe. In Dutch is hex, and in Sweden it's hex. So no common word. And this is interesting because you'd think if it was a strong concept, there would be an obvious word. Because if you compare that word for devil, diabolos in Greek, and almost every European language has some variation of diabolos. We have devil, it's the same word. Witches can be many things, if you can see on the right-hand side here. And this is why perhaps there is no common word for witches. It's an invented word, really, because it covers such a multitude of skills, if that's the right word. There is a difference between good witches, who are believed to practice beneficial or white magic, and evil witches who practice harmful or black magic. Many were assumed to do both because, for example, let's say your cow was ill and you consulted a witch. She might come along and do some incantations, maybe give the cow some potions she's connected. Your cow might recover. But if your neighbor's cow then becomes sick, ill, perhaps even die, the neighbor would say, well, the witch, she was a good witch for you, which is a bad witch to me because she's transferred the illness from your cow to my cow. So this is the dichotomy we have. In the medieval period, the Roman Catholic Church was initially tolerant of witches, but the situation had changed by the 15th century when witches were regarded as agents of the devil. So this emergence of demonology, with the devil becoming more and more important and witches being seen as the devil's agents. Under the Scottish Witchcraft Act 1563, both the practice of witchcraft and consulting with witches were capital offences, i.e. you got executed for doing that. This painting by Goya, showing witches' Sabbath, is a very famous painting, but this is how people interpreted witches and the devil. So here's a coven of witches meeting with the devil in the shape of the horny goat, and the devil's giving them their instructions of what they have to go and do. The idea of an organized witch cult originates in the second half of the 15th century, expounded in this book of 1486 called Malleus Maleficarum, translated as The Hammer of Witches. It was a treatise about witchcraft by a German clergyman, in fact a monk, Heinrich Kramer. It's quite an important book in terms of what it said and the effect it had. Kramer calls sorcery heresy, which was a crime at the time. He recommends torture to get confessions, and death as the only way to end the evils of witchcraft. Heretics were burned at the stake, and he suggested the same for witches. And this was one of the very important movements towards the increasingly brutal prosecution of witches in the 16th and 17th centuries. Malleus Maleficarum, the book, was in print for 300 years. It was originally 1486, but the book you see here, this version, is 1669. So still around 200 years on, still having a lot of effect. Other books appeared. This one, Ulrich Molitor, on witches and female soothsayers, just 3 years after Kramer took a softer view. He maintained that attendance at black masses where Satan was worshipped are hallucinated episodes of dreams. He does not refute the existence of witchcraft, but counsels against confessions extracted by torture and court. So he took a rather gentler view. But what I find this book interesting for is this illustration here. I think it's the earliest illustration of a witch's cauldron. And what it says here, Holschnitt 6, woodcut 6, Hexenküche, witch's kitchen, witch's brew, two witches cook a brew to create, it says here, hail weather, a hailstorm. Here's the hailstorm. And here the witches round the cauldron. And what's interesting is the cauldron, I want to point out. That's not a metal cauldron, I think. That looks like a ceramic cauldron. And we'll talk about that later. Another book, 1584, 100 years after the Malleus, was very different. This was by Reginald Scott, so it was in English, and it's called The Discovery of Witchcraft. It has an immensely long title. This whole page is the title, but if we just look at the bits in red, The Discovery of Witchcraft, proving that contracts, etc., are but erroneous novelties and imaginary conceptions. Also, wherein likewise unchristian practices and inhumane dealings upon aged, melancholy, and superstitious people, all which are very necessary to be known for the undeceiving of just judges, justices, and jurors, before they pass sentence upon poor, miserable, and ignorant people. So it's making very clear he does not believe that witches should be treated in the way they are. He said the contracts with the devil are erroneous, they're imaginary, that unchristian practices with torture on poor, aged, melancholy, superstitious people, and that the judges should be aware of this before they pass sentence on poor, miserable, ignorant people. So he's making it very clear what was going on. Unfortunately, this book didn't really have the effect it might have done. That was because of this man, James VI of Scotland. James had an absolute obsession with witches. He saw them as the ultimate evil. They were agents of the devil. And as far as he concerned, the devil was trying to push James off his throne. So James responded to Scott's book by writing his own book called Demonology in form of a dialogue. So demonology is a dialogue between two people, Philomathes, a skeptical character who asks questions, while Epistemon provides the expert answers. Through this dialogue, James presents his views and arguments against witchcraft. Now, it's a very clever book. James was a very clever man, the wisest fool in Christendom. And the dialogue here, Philomathes is a skeptic. He asks questions, are witches evil? And Epistemon answers, of course they're evil, more evil than you think. But of course, Epistemon is the king. It's the king dealing with every question that could be raised, and he demolishes them in his absolute obsession against witches. In 1603, he passed an act against conjuration, witchcraft, and dealing with evil and wicked spirits. And he also was very much a follower of this quotation of the Bible from Exodus, thou shalt not suffer a witch to live. That is given as a reason that witches should be killed. But that was written 3,000 years ago for Exodus. The Hebrew word that was translated as witch, I mean, what did it mean in Hebrew? It may not have meant witch. This book, News from Scotland, 1591, was not written by James, but he had a hand in it. It's about the witch trials that took place in North Berwick, in which James played a part. In fact, he actually interrogates some of the witches. So this is a picture from that, showing James on his throne. Here's the questioner, and here's 4 terrified women being asked questions. Are you a witch? No. Hit them over the head. Are you a witch? No. Hit them again. That was only the beginning of the torture. The North Berwick witch trials of 1591, more than 100 suspected witches in North Berwick were arrested. Several confessed under torture to doing evil, including poisoning the king and other members of his household and causing hazards for the king's ships. So this is all about King James going to Denmark to get his wife, Princess Anne of Denmark, that he married. So she was supposed to come over from Denmark on a ship, but her boat was 6 times prevented from getting, and it was in fact blown off course from Denmark and ended up in Norway. And somehow the message got to James that she was in Oslo rather than Copenhagen. So he decided he would go and fetch her. So he sets off by boat. His trip was not without incident. He was blown back onto the coast of Fife, but he eventually got to Oslo, married Anne, and he spent 6 months in Scandinavia, Norway and Denmark being one country then, really enjoying himself, loving the culture there. But eventually he had to come back with his new queen. So they set off a flotilla of ships from Copenhagen. I think it was Copenhagen, and most of the ships had a safe passage to back to Scotland. But James's boat was held up by contrary winds, even though the others were sailing. His boat got into trouble. The picture here is not of his boat. His boat did get him and his queen safely to Edinburgh. The ship shown in this picture was a boat that set off from Fife, carrying gifts and jewels for the new queen. It was lost. It foundered, and 60 people were drowned. James was sure convinced this was witchcraft. And indeed, this was repeated in Denmark, where the delay to the boats from the Denmark end was also blamed on witchcraft. And witch trials went in parallel with the North Berwick trials. Witch trials in Denmark went parallel with the North Berwick ones. So 100 suspected witches were arrested. Several confessed under torture to doing evil, including poisoning the king and other members of his household and causing hazards for the king's ships. Agnes Sampson, a respected and elderly woman, initially refused to confess and was put to severe torture. She was brought before King James in Holyrood, where she denied all the charges. All her hair was shaved, and she was fastened to the wall of a cell by a skull's bridle and kept without sleep. She was also examined for the devil's mark, which we'll come to in a minute, and that was discovered. Agnes confessed to the 53 indictments against her, including attending a sabbat with 200 witches. She was finally strangled and burned as a witch. It's pretty brutal stuff. But we can see what's happening here. James, because he was interested in her and the witches of North Berwick, he was asking some of the questions, and she denied them. I mean, this is an amazing thing to do in front of the king. I mean, she must have been very cowed, one would assume she would have been, but she held her ground. Her hair was shaved, and that was so they could look for the devil's mark. And he was then held to the cell by the skull's bridle. This is a skull's bridle, a sort of metal helmet with a bit holding your tongue, and you're chained to a wall, so you can't, you're upright, you can't fall asleep, and you hang yourself. So poor Agnes had to confess, was the only way out of this, and she was strangled and burned as a witch. So here's a picture of a witch trial and actually the bit of looking for the devil's mark. So this poor woman here is being examined for a devil's mark. And it could be any mark. The argument was that if you sold your soul to the devil, renounced your Christian baptism, the devil would touch you and leave a mark on your body. It could be any mark, a wart, a mole, a blemish of the skin. And these poor women were examined for that, and almost always a mark would be found somewhere. But once a mark was found, then the poor victim knew the time was up, because they could deny all the other things that they were said to do about meeting the devil or whatever, or flying through the air, but they couldn't deny a mark, even though themselves they may not be able to see it. So that's when many gave in and confessed. So that was 1591. I'm going to jump 70 years to another set of witch trials that took place in Auldearn. Isabel Gowdy was around 30 years old and was accused of witchcraft. She claimed to have performed rituals to cure fevers and broken bones, but also readily confessed that she was guilty of attempting to destroy her neighbor's crops. She was using used clay figures to cast spells over neighbors. She claimed she could turn herself into a jackdaw, a cat, or a hare, and she'd been part of a coven of witches who met the devil in the old kirk of Auldearn. She would also fly to Fairyland, where she saw elf boys whittling flint arrows to shoot at people they wished to destroy. Quite amazing things, because she was not tortured. She gave this, when I say willingly, perhaps the words were put in her mouth, but she repeated them. Her unparalleled behavior may be due to some form of psychosis or delusions of an unstable mind. During her confession, she implicated another 12 people as witches and members of the coven, a coven being 13. So she gave these another 12 names. And then when these people were questioned, they gave further names. And a total of 42 witches from all down were tried, almost all of whom, I think only two were not executed. So dark days. However, the great witch hunt of 1661 to 2 saw attitudes to trials changing. Towards the end of the 1600s, people had access to lawyers who cast doubt on the testimony or the evidence. Judges were becoming more skeptical, particularly confessions made under torture. As a result, courts were clearing more people of charges. But it was not until the early 18th century that the idea of the organized witch cult was abandoned, the idea that witches were banding together to do evil things. The Witchcraft Act of 1735, 1736 in Scotland repealed the earlier laws, but still made it a crime to pretend to exercise or use any kind of witchcraft, sorcery, etc. So that was a change. It was no longer a capital offence, but it was viewed now as a fraud rather than evil. So that if you consulted a witch and the witch did magic, well, that was impossible. She was defrauding you. But the Witchcraft Act remained in force for centuries. It wasn't repealed until the 20th century, though prosecutions under it became very rare. All this evidence from these witch trials was written down. So when you were being, giving evidence, asked all these questions, words put in your mouth, they were written down by clerks. Though the clerks recorded them in the third person, it wasn't necessarily your words. The clerk wrote down what he thought you were saying. But anyway, there's a huge amount of evidence in the National Archives of Scotland of these trials in different forms. And this lady, Christina Lorna, she compiled a list of witches. So this book here on the left is just hundreds of pages of witches. She found 3,069 of them. Here are their names. Here's the date of their trial. Here's where they come from: Fife, Crook of Devon, and Kinrossshire, and so forth. And the trial status COM stands for commission. Many trials were done on a commission. People petitioned the Privy Council saying that somebody was a witch. The Privy Council would set up a commission, a local commission, involving, important people, the local landowners, the local ministers, or whatever, and they would then examine the poor girl and ask all these questions. So we can see here in the case of Crook of Devon, and there's another whole page of Crook of Devon, executed, 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 one acquitted here. At the top, a couple of not knowns. But in fact, most of the trials, the outcome is not known. Of these 3,069 witches, 599 are recorded as being executed, but we don't know what happened to the other 2,500. But certainly the majority of these were executed. For some reason, they recorded all the evidence given at the trial, but the verdict was often not recorded. Another survey of Scottish witchcraft was 20 years ago with Julian Goodare and Louise Yeoman at University of Edinburgh. And they've created an interactive database. So here's the form. If you can get access to this on your computer, you need the Access Data program. Then you put in the name of a witch and up come all the information about them. Now, this survey, they found 3,837 people accused of witchcraft. And again, because of the under-recording of the verdicts, they estimate that 2,500 are believed to have been executed. Witches didn't always give their employment status, but where they did, this has been put into this diagram here. And you can immediately see that by far the greater numbers is servant and vagrant. So if you're a vagrant, no fixed abode, then there's a good chance you might be taken up for a witch. And often vagrants might have been not very nice people. If you turn them away from the door, they might curse you and various other things. A servant, and the word servant means you're serving somebody. So you could be a house servant, a kitchen servant, a tradesman servant, a farm servant, whatever. But clearly they were a very large proportion of the people questioned. And of course, these are people by and large who were uneducated, who were not wily, had no idea how to defend themselves in court, repeated what they were expected to say. Midwife is also relatively high. And midwives, though they can do good jobs at childbirth, are seen as cunning women. They often use sleight of hand, or seem to do, and maybe they had other powers. But at the end of the day, it's still no more than 5% of the total, but they still stick out, as does weaver. And I can't explain weaver unless it is just the fact there were lots of weavers. But if you came from one of these other professions, the chance of being accused of a witch was much less. Here's a graph of the trials through the years in Scotland, and you can see, though there's a background noise, the red is the trials, the number of people accused, the blue, those known to be executed. There's always one or two a year, but we get these spikes, 1591, the North Berwick ones, 1661 to 2, the Aldern trials. So these are very noticeable spikes. And the spikes sometimes come in periods of uncertainty during the Civil War, just after Charles I's coronation, and again just after the arrival of Charles II, when often these kings were very conscious of their position, scared again that they might lose their throne. But it eventually dies out after 1700. The incidences are very small, and only one here. If we compare this with Europe, we get some interesting figures. A lot of information here in this, but here are the countries and here are the number of witches accused and executed. So the top line, Germany, a total of 16,000 accused, almost 10,000 executed. Switzerland, almost 10,000 accused, 4,000 executed, and so forth. But Germany is a big country, so when you actually look at it pro rata per 100,000 people, it's only 137, while Switzerland, a much smaller country, has a much higher number. But Scotland, you see, is second highest. So the second highest pro rata is Scotland. If you look at other countries, particularly Catholic countries, France, Spain, Belgium, Italy, the numbers are really tiny by comparison. As is England, is also small in relation, of course, to the total population. And in England, you could not be executed in a witch unless you had believed or proved to actually cause the death of someone. So you could only be executed if you were party to someone's death, but that didn't hold in Scotland. You could be executed just for being found to be a witch. And so we come to the last witch to be executed in Scotland, Janet Horne, in Dornoch in 1727, a well-known case. And this nice information board provided by History Links Museum tells you all about it. Janet lived with a daughter who had some form of congenital deformity. She perhaps had a club arm or a club foot. And Janet was accused of trying to turn her daughter into the devil's pony. The daughter escaped, but Janet was tried, found guilty. And according to what it says here, the next day she was stripped, rolled in tar, and placed in a barrel. She was carried to the place where she was burned alive. Now, this may be true, but if it is, I'm surprised. I'm not saying that she wasn't killed, executed, but to be burned alive was unusual. Normally, witches were strangled first. They were rarely burned alive. Again, unless in Scotland they were believed to have actually killed someone. Also, where are we? All this business of being tarred and rolled in a barrel. I mean, I think a lot of that is folklore. But I don't think there's any doubt that maybe Janet Horne was the last witch, and she was executed in Dornoch in 1727. And there's a memorial stone for her in Dornoch. And there are many of these witch memorials throughout Scotland. This one here, bottom right, is in the forecourt of Edinburgh Castle, commemorating many people who were burnt there. Okay, so that's a bit of a long introduction on witches and witchcraft and the witch trials. Well, what about the evidence for witches and witchcraft? So these are some of the headings I'll be looking at. And most of these ones here, I've got questions after them because do they really exist? Anyway, what definitely does exist is the instruments of torture. So we saw the witch's bridle before. This it goes over your head. This piece holds your tongue down, and sometimes with a spike on there, and you're chained to a wall standing up. So if you fell asleep, you throttle yourself. And these neck shackles did the same thing. You were just chained to a wall standing up. The thumbikins, or pillywinks, they were called in Scotland, crushed your thumbs so you could never use them again. And there are many other forms of torture that I am not going to go into. But getting back to the witches, where is the actual evidence, physical evidence of witches? It's a good question. Now, here again is the classic picture of the witches, 3 witches round a big cauldron. Well, this drawing is not contemporary with Macbeth, though it's illustrating that, because that is a pretty gigantic cauldron, and you have a bit of a job lifting it. I'm not quite sure what the chain is fixed to anyway. But cauldrons, witches' cauldrons, what we think of a witch's cauldron, here the classic cast iron cauldron, cooking pot really, but usually referred to as a witch's cauldron, they cannot date from before 1709. Casting of iron only happened after Abraham Darby at Coalbrookdale was able to smelt metal using coking coal, smelt iron using coking coal. So 1709 in England, 1759 in Scotland with the Carron Foundry near Falkirk. So cast iron pots are only available, as it were, from 1709 onwards. So whatever these witches were dancing around, it wasn't a cast iron pot. They might have been dancing around a brass pot, but brass was very expensive. It wasn't an easy thing to come by. You had to be the elite to afford a brass cooking pot. But even so, they were quite small. They were family sized. If you put that at scale, this is what it looks like. So these poor witches, if they were dancing around a cauldron, it wasn't a very big one. Though I'm not trying to say some cauldrons like that might not have been used by an individual witch, because some of them did brew up potions with herbs and things and use that for curing and healing. But there are, apart from two very, very unlikely ones, there are no known witches' cauldrons that survive. I've put this in because it is in the National Museum of Scotland. It's called a witch's cursing bone, consisting of a peat-stained deer's marrowbone fixed in a ring of bog oak. So here we see a bit of bog oak with a hole in it. The hole is caused by a knot falling out of it. And then this bone is put in. According to this, the blood of a newly killed hen was poured through the bone while a curse was spoken. This belonged to a witch from Glenshire near Inverary. It's in the National Museum, but they are very careful with the language. You can see in red, reputed witch, supposedly used, according to. So they're a bit skeptical. But another one did turn up, or seemed to turn up, in Dorset of all places. And this one has been compared with the Glenshire, though it doesn't have the bone. But it did have some sympathetic magic attached to it. It was said that if your cow wouldn't give milk, you could milk it through the hole, and that might work. Again, I'm very skeptical as to whether these were ever used in that way. At the end of the day, these are just bits of wood. I mean, from a bog oak, the knots fall out, and usually the bit of wood around the knot is harder and survives longer. But there it is. That's how it's presented in national museums. I'm even more skeptical about these witches' ropes. If you look at the right-hand side, which is also in the national museums, it's a witch's rope believed to have been dragged across a field in which cows were grazed, dragged by a witch to charm the milk of a neighbour's cow into her own pail. The one on the left is even more doubtful, though it's the same idea, tugging at a rope made of hairs drawn from the tail of every cow within reach, while muttering an incantation. The witch had the power to draw all the milk from a neighbour's cow to her own pail. And you'll notice that these last few words are exactly the same on the other side. And that's taken from this book by F. Marion McNeill on Scottish folklore. I mean, if you think about this rope, it says a rope made from hairs drawn from the tail of every cow within reach. Just excuse me a minute while I pull a hair out of every cow and weave it into a rope. Highly unlikely, I think. We're on safer ground here, I think, with the clay body of the clay corpse, or cor crea in Gaelic. Supposedly, when a witch wanted to destroy anyone to whom she had an ill will, she often made a corpse of clay and placed it in a stream so that the water trickled slowly on it. As the clay body wasted, so the live body of the person it resembled was also supposed to waste away. Sometimes pins were stuck in the clay body to make the death of the doomed one more painful. So this image comes from Glenarchart. It doesn't really look like James, but anyway, it comes from Glenarchart and was presented by Major Grant to the Pitt Rivers Museum in Oxford. So it's quite an old thing. And it's an even older tradition. So this clay image here is 4th century AD from Roman Egypt. It was found in this pot. So she's got 13 pins stuck into her in various strategic places. And it is accompanied by a lead curse. This is a piece of lead, and written on it in Greek is a curse against this woman. And it's written by her husband because she's clearly being straying from the marital bed. And he is not awfully pleased. And he tells her to come back and stop doing terrible things. And I tell you, if you read it today, even today, you would blush. Here's the same concept, but much more recently. This is a 19th century doll with a name, Edith Wilkes, and a bit of paper, and 3 pins, black-headed pins. These are mourning pins pinned into the doll. So clearly somebody was getting at Edith Wilkes, found in a Victorian house in Hampstead. And this is also the same concept. Here is another peg doll in the left here with a big cloth around it, but tucked inside the cloth was this spell. And I'll read it to you. It's very interesting. Mary Ann Ward, I act this spell upon you from my whole heart, wishing you to never rest, nor eat, nor sleep the resting part of your life. I hope your flesh will waste away, and I hope you will never spend another penny I ought to have. Wishing this from my whole heart. Well, that's pretty heartfelt spell. I think there's a bit of a family argument here. Somebody's spending the inheritance by the sound of it. But anyway, poor Mary Ann Ward is going to get in for it with this, found in a bit of brickwork in Hereford. So we said a bit about surviving evidence of witchcraft. Though, as I said, I don't believe in witchcraft actually working. It's magic, and I don't believe in magic, but people clearly did, and that's all that matters. And because they believed there was witchcraft, they tried to counter witchcraft. So we're now going to look at, for the second half of the lecture, things protection against witchcraft. So we'll start off with round trees and look at all sort of material objects. Rowan trees, of course, are well known, and many houses and farms in Scotland would have a pair of rowan trees in front of the house. Exactly why, I'm not sure. What is the connection? Some people say the red berries is the blood of Christ, but generally Christian symbolism is not used very much against witches. I don't know why, but it doesn't seem to be. One theory about rounds is that here's a round berry, not a tomato, and you will see in the base of the round berry there is a five-pointed star, a pentacle, which is where the flower was attached. And it leaves this scar. Now, a pentacle is a symbol used against witches, so this may be the reason. But rowan wood was used to make round crosses. So here we've got a little cross of wood with red thread tied round it, and another one here with a ribbon around it. And these would be carried or hung up in your house or farm. But also, this is just a round twig that's been tied into a simple knot. And it was one of three presented at the Pitt Rivers Museum. And apparently, witches found knots difficult. They couldn't unravel a knot. They were held up by a knot. So this is the theory behind knots. And even farmers would put knots in cows' tails to deter witches. Let's move on to actual physical things, charms, amulets, and talismans, which are broader than just witchcraft, I agree, but they are all part of the story. And they're all charms. An amulet protects a person against evil forces or bad luck, particularly if you think you're ill, you've been bewitched. You use an amulet, just as people today with these copper bangles on their arms. While a talisman is just a good luck symbol, something you have to wish you luck. So if we look at this amulet of rock crystal, because rock crystal and quartz from prehistory was seen as having magical powers, healing powers. And the idea was you dipped this into water while saying a charm or prayer. And sometimes you would drink the water, or if your cow was ill, you'd give the water that the stone had been dipped in to the cow. So this one's old, you can see, more than 1,000 years old. And many of these rock crystal amulets are probably that old. So it's a tradition that goes back a long way. Many of them have got later mounts. This one here is a rock crystal ball, could be 1,000 years old, but it's in a silver mount, which is 16th or 17th century. It's got a little chain so you could suspend it while you dipped it in the water. And this is a similar one, a rather duller stone, but again in a silver mount and a little hoop for the chain. And you dipped it in the water. Now, what's interesting is this one on the left belonged to the Stuarts of Ardshield, and the one on the right to the Campbells of Glenorchy. Elite families, because only elite people could afford something as fancy as this. I've put this picture on because I have a connection with it. Here are another 4 charm stones with the silver mounts. And if you look, you'll see that each of them was presented at the National Museum of Scotland by Miss Begg. I knew Miss Begg. She lived in London when I was a young man, and I was introduced to her through a mutual friend. She was an amazing lady. She was very rich. She lived in a hotel, and she spent all her time going around antique shops and antique markets looking for old jewelry. She was an expert in jewelry, wrote articles about it. And she could identify these things of what they were. They were charm stones, and she collected these. And I remember her showing me these, along with trays of Roman and medieval rings and other things, luck and booth brooches, and so on. And when she died, she left them to the National Museum of Scotland. And I went to the National Museum a month or so ago to take some pictures for this lecture. And I was very pleased to see my former friend, my now deceased friend, Miss Begg, being commemorated in this way. But in addition to rock crystal, other stones, arrowheads, flint arrowheads were used as charms. It was believed that these were fired by fairies at a cow and made the cow elf struck or elf shot. And the cure was to dip the arrow in water and then give the water to the cow. But it's the same concept. I mean, flint and rock crystal are very similar chemically, but put in a silver mount so you can suspend it in the water. I'm very impressed by this one because this is a quartz arrowhead and not that recognizable as an arrowhead. Now, whoever identified this in the past should join the Tatterdale field walking team. This is a nice one, tanged and barbed arrowhead with silver mounts and then attached to a long cord made of woven horsehair. And this almost certainly would have been fixed around the waistband of a farmer to protect his animals. This beautiful one was a metal detecting find. And 2022, again, you can see it's a tanged and barbed arrowhead of Aberdeen flint, this honey-colored flint from Aberdeenshire, and again in a silver gilt frame. And on the back, those initials, IK, I think it is, and CS. I would say this is almost certainly a wedding present given by IK to his wife, CS, or given by a third person to give these people good luck in their marriage, protection from evil. Blue glass beads were also an ancient protection against the evil eye and witches' craft generally. The top ones here are from ancient Egypt, and they've actually got evil eyes on them. The idea being that if the witch put her evil eye on you, your evil eye reflected it back. So you countered witchcraft with witchcraft, and that's a theme we'll meet again. These ones are Roman beads, but the same concept, blue beads. And even these ones, much more modern, still the same idea. It was protection against evil. And blue beads like these, and often much longer ones to go around the neck, often were belonged to gypsy travelers. Gypsy travelers, famously superstitious, of course. But the most common amulet to keep evil at bay was a flint with a hole. And here's a collection of flints with holes collected on our beach. Not all flints have holes, but if you in somewhere like Dorset, where all the stones are flint, you will find holy flints. But the idea of holes in witches, there's a very strong connection. The hole somehow gives you protection and scares the witch. And here, this setting of stones here, Menantol in Cornwall, people used to pass sick babies through the hole and so forth. This is my collection of witch stones that I've picked up over the years. They're nearly all from Aberdeenshire. And you see they're flints with holes and have red strings or red ribbon through them. And they were hung up in barns and byres to protect the animals particularly. So there is a case of a woman hanging in Stonehaven, hanging one over her bed to prevent her from nightmares. So in Scotland, we call these witch stones. In England, they're called hag stones. Mare stone is the same thing, but it's not mare meaning horse. The mare was a word for just evil. The hagstone bit is that these particularly protected horses, and farmers would hang them up in the stable over the horse to prevent the witches taking the horse at night, because witches would come into your stable, take your horse, ride it furiously all night, return it next morning, worn out and sweating, i.e. it was hag-ridden. And this is the origin of the phrase hag-ridden. It was a belief that your horse had been appropriated overnight by a witch. But in addition to holy flints, stone axes were also used as symbols against, as artifacts against witchcraft. They didn't recognize these as axes. I mean, axes were made of metal, not stone. We all know that. So they thought. But they thought these were thunderbolts. Where thunder lightning hit the ground, it was the stone axe that hit the ground. So they were seen as magical. So you picked them up, drilled a hole in them, and then hung them up in the usual way. This one is not an axe. It's just a large chunk of stone. It's a foot tall, 30 centimeters tall. It has a natural hole. I think it's a bit of volcanic rock with vesicles in it, with a cord, a multicolored cord in this case, has been passed through it, that again hung up in a farm building. And you could increase the efficiency of your holy stones by increasing the number. So here's 8 on a cord, and there are 5 knots in the cord. Again, remember, witches cannot unravel knots. So this was good protection. And this is a similar thing. It's just a cord with 3 beads with holes and a talisman attached to it. But in addition to stone with holes, metal objects, and particularly iron, was also very effective against witches. Probably because, to make metal, you had to create fire, and witches didn't like fire. This is from this book, Reginald Scott. He says a way to is to nail a horseshoe in your house, and you'll know which shall have the power to enter. The big problem is, which way up do you put the horseshoe? Some people say you hang it this way up, because if you put it that way up, the good luck will run out the end of the horns. While others say, but if you put it that way up, the devil will perch on as a seat in there. So maybe the best way is to have one of each. Horse brasses are related to this because horse brasses were shiny things put on horses going back to Roman times with paterae, and a number of different types. This is a strip of horse brasses here, but here is an older one. It's in the shape of a crescent, and that was definitely seen as an anti-witch symbol, as is the daisy whale or hexafoil. And here's one here, again, a crescent moon, but with a pentafoil, the five-pointed star inside it. So these were all anti-witch symbols. But of course, people forgot that's what their original purpose was, and they more and more became decoration. And by the end, horses were weighed down by whole belts of horse brasses like that. I put this in because we do know a little bit about it. This is a charm against witchcraft. It's a rusty chain with a bit of bone hanging the end of it. But the story is that this came from a stable in the Isle of Man and was known to have been put there by a witch called Ruth Quayle. Quayle is a very famous Manx surname, and she charged a shilling for the charm. So we can think of perhaps a farmer, a bit worried about the safety of his animals, consulted a witch, Ruth Quayle, said, I want something to protect my horses. And she said, right, have this and have 1 shilling, please, for that. So here we can see the feeling of witches were still around. You needed to have something to counter witches was still strong in 1921. Getting back to metal generally, if you put an old key in particular with a hagstone, it increased its power. Scissors and knives were seen as being powerful against witches, and they were placed under mattresses and even in cots. Sounds very dangerous, though the scissors needed to be open in the shape of a cross. Other cutting instruments, sickles and scythes, were placed on outbuildings to keep witches at bay. And I'm going to put this picture I put in. It's not directly related to this lecture, but I just saw this recently. This is a burial, 17th century burial from Poland, where this young lady, aged over 20, died and buried, and a sickle was placed over her neck, not to cut her head off, but as protection against evil. Witch balls are perhaps one of the best known of apotropaic objects against witches because they're decorative. And, I still occasionally see them hanging in windows today. So they're just spheres of blown glass, mirrored and colored. And 2 theories behind them. First, you suspend them in a window to reflect away ill fortune, as witches couldn't stand seeing their own reflection. So if a witch came up, you could see the reflection. That's not a witch, that's me taking a photograph. That would repel them. Or some people believe that the ball itself would attract ill luck, and that would have fallen in the household otherwise. But you had to keep the ball clean to get rid of the ill luck. They were very popular in fishing districts. I mean, these certainly, I have seen these in houses. And fishermen didn't need to buy a special ball. They could just use a glass float. In the days when floats are made of glass, it was replaced by metal and, of course, not plastic. But you hung this in your house, a fisherman's house, to protect them, the fishermen, when at sea. And there are even stories of fishermen hanging stones, flints with holes in them on the mast of the boat. But witch balls are still with us today as the baubles on a Christmas tree. The baubles in a Christmas tree are a direct descendant of witch balls, and because they were seen as decorative, they have been preserved. And hopefully this collection will protect the inhabitant of this house. But in addition to witch balls, we have other glass objects, and particularly these rods or walking canes, which are usually twisted in some form. It's the twisting that confuses the witch. You place this somewhere between the fireplace and your bed. So if the witch go down the chimney, before she got to your bed, she would encounter this twisted rod, and that would give her trouble. She wouldn't maybe go any further. Or else she might find one that was full of little sweets, hundreds and thousands, and she'd spend all night counting them rather than getting on with her evil business. It says here that these are made around Nailsea in Somerset, which I'm sure they are, but they're also made elsewhere in Starbridge in West Midlands and also at Alloa. Alloa Glassworks is one of Scotland's major glassworks, latterly mainly making beer bottles, but they made other things. And here's the employees of Alaglass Works one day getting the photos taken, and they're holding up various things, large number of which are these sticks, walking sticks. And I've put blue circles on some of them. The yellow circles are round witch balls, these silvery balls. These were made by glass workers often at the end of a shift if there was glass left over. If you had a bit of hot metal, as it was called, you couldn't just leave it because it would go hard. You used it up as quick as possible. Paperweights are often made that way very simply, but glass rods and sticks and bowls would be made. And these were called firings or fairings, and the workmen would sell them to the public to get a few bits of money for that. One of the most effective antidotes to witches was witch bottles. Here's the classic so-called witch bottle, a Bellarmine jug or Bellarmine bottle, supposed to be this beard mask here, was meant to be Bishop Bellarmine. It isn't. This was a German thing, and these are called Beardman or Bartmann jugs or bottles in Germany. But that's a classic 17th century bottle that would originally contain wine or beer, but it could be repurposed for other things. And this one has got interesting objects, nails and pins and some sort of more organic looking matter. Here's a whole collection of them in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, showing that they really were quite common. People often had these, and some of them have been broken open to show their contents. So this nice one here, now again, the Pitter's Museum in Oxford, contained human hair and a cloth pierced with nails. And it almost certainly had once contained urine, but often the urine leaked away or evaporated. But we'll come to urine in a minute. And the theory behind this, if you felt you'd been bewitched, actually, there was a bit of witch in you. There was witch DNA in you almost. So to get your own back at the witch, you had to give some of your tissue in a position to deter the witch. So that's why you would put hair in it. The cloth heart is meant to be the witch's heart with the nails fixed in it. Here's another one, x-rayed again, showing various things. And here are the contents: nails and some hair, bent pins, nail clippings. Some person clipped their nails, but again, that's human tissue along with the hair, and it had been filled with urine. Let's go back. These witch bottles were usually placed in where they would deter a witch. They'd be placed under the threshold, under the hearthstone, or up a chimney, so that witches would encounter this and see, if you want, witch DNA. So you're using witchcraft against witchcraft. These stoneware bottles were replaced by glass bottles, and then these initial bottles here, of course, echoed the shape, the pot-bellied shape of the stoneware bottles. But bottles were used right through to, this is one here, 19th or 20th century, an ink bottle. It's got some red thread in it and other things and various bits in there. And it's not one of these bottles, but another bottle found up a chimney in Northampton contained shards of glass, fish hooks, and human teeth. Well, that's making it pretty obvious. This is an interesting bottle because what you could do, in addition to putting it up the chimney, you could set it at the side of the fire, full of urine and the bits of metal. And if it was well stoppered, it would expand and explode, killing the witch. But in this case, they've collected the broken bits and put them up the chimney. So just in case the witch wasn't really killed and came down the chimney, he or she would be deterred by these pieces. So that's witch bottles. Another very important way of trying to keep witches at bay was with shoes. Shoes are the commonest thing found up chimneys, behind brick walls, under floorboards, etc. This picture here is Northampton Museum, who maintain a concealed shoe index. Northampton, of course, being the centre of shoemaking. And there are often old shoes, there are often children's shoes, and often left shoes. But these were found in, as I said, all different places, going right back to the 14th century, one shoe found behind the choir stalls at Winchester Cathedral. But not only shoes, hats are here, and umbrellas just at the bottom here. So what's the theory behind this? It is that witches were believed to be attracted by the human scent of a shoe, and after entering one, found themselves trapped as they were unable to get back out. Well, that's the story. And there is a lot of folklore about this. There was an old woman who lived in a shoe. This all get connected. Shoes, of course, were also fertility symbols. And I mentioned in a previous lecture how there'd be shoes would be tied in the back of a wedding car, or shoe-shaped snuff boxes were given as wedding presents. So I think there's more to just this. I think these were good luck, they were fertility symbols, but at the same time would deter witches. But in addition to shoes, here's a shoe here, but also the remains of a poor chicken, which is almost certainly walled up alive. A cat was the most favored animal to wall up, again, probably alive. This one's from Elgin Cathedral. You see the poor cat has died, probably in agony. And here's another two cats. Why cats? Well, again, it may be related to the fact that witches always had cats, a black cat called the witch's familiar, and the witch could change herself into a cat. So if the witch had changed herself into a cat, you put a cat in the chimney or under the floorboards, again, it was witchcraft against witchcraft. But in addition to actual objects, you could use symbols, apotropaic symbolism, literally to turn away. And here's some of the symbols that was used. Here's the daisy wheel. Here's VV for the Virgo Virgonum, which is the Virgin Mary, and M itself for Mary, the pentangle, and this one, the sort of saltire cross with stopped ends. Here's some daisy wheels on a wall of a church. Here's more ornate ones. It's decorative. At the same time, it is symbolism. Here's them on a barn door, various daisy wheels, hexafoils, and some of them don't have the final arc. You think, well, maybe somebody's forgotten to put the final arc on, but I think there's more to it than that. I think these were meant to be incomplete. So if a witch saw that, it was work in progress, i.e. you weren't going to come back. So that might deter the witch. This is a much cruder version on a dairy door, all from the same place in Suffolk, and just circles. And these scratches are, in fact, the M and VV for Mary. This fireplace beam from Anstruther and Fife also has apotropaic symbolism on it. We can have a drawing of that. So the heavy lines are these ones here. Here's the M for Mary. But somebody has then burnt marks against that with a taper or a candle, made burn marks. And of course, again, that's fire against witches. This burn mark here, which we can expand here, has other symbols on top of it. Again, an M for Mary. So you've got three sets of symbols here, the heavy ones, the burn marks, and then there's lighter ones on top. So someone was, perhaps different generations, repeating the idea, putting these apotropaic symbolism on a fireplace beam so that if a witch came down your chimney, she could see that you were ready for them. Firebacks, metal cast iron firebacks, which were to stop the wall of your fireplace burning away. Again, we've got the VV for the Virgin or the M. And one of them has two Christian crosses and again, a couple of Vs. And as I said earlier, for some reason, and I don't know why, Christian iconography is not used very much in this type of evidence, symbolism against witches. Bedposts, if the witch got down your chimney and got near your bed, then your posts would have symbols, particularly this saltire cross with stopped ends on it. And that was, I think, is seen as stop, no way through, way is barred, because you didn't want them in your bed behind the curtains around that four-poster bed. But if they did get in the bed, then your warming pan has a hexafoil on it. Again, further protection. And you could keep witches out of the kitchen with hexafoils. These are butter stamps, which have got hexafoils on them. So when you make a pat of butter, you stamp it with a hexafoil, and that will again keep witches away. And even on a humble apple corer, just a bone, an animal bone with the saltire cross, no way through. I actually own this, and I didn't know what it was until I was preparing this lecture. I suddenly thought about this cross, and there it was. It's an apotropaic symbol on an apple corer. And this settle here is interesting. The red upholstery is modern, fairly modern. It would originally been all wood. It's nicely dated AD 1718, but you will see that there are burn marks all over it. In fact, there are 85 of these marks. And some of them have been made with candles, but some of them with red hot pokers, these heavy ones there. You may think a terrible thing to do to a nice bit of furniture, but the marking, the symbolism, the apotropaic symbolism of this was clearly more important than the beauty of the settle. So that's really all I want to say about witchcraft generally, and in particular the material objects against witchcraft and the symbolism, the apotropaic symbolism. I just want to last one, very last slides, is we word with modern witchcraft. Witchcraft never went away. Even, after the 1736 Act making it no longer a capital offence, people believed in witchcraft, which is why all these objects we've been looking at, they nearly all date from the 18th and 19th and 20th centuries. But after the Second World War, there was a revival of witchcraft in the UK, but particularly in America. Under the name of Wicca, was an organizer, it's like a parallel religion, but also there's a broader group of eclectic witches who practice a blend of witchcraft incorporating other elements. In the 2021 census, 74,000 pagans were said, well, 74,000 people said they were pagans. Under the bit where he's entered religion, 74,000 pagans. Now, I'm not saying they're all witches, but a significant number, I'm sure, would identify as modern witches. You can take instruction, you can sit for exam in Wicca level 1, and just to keep up to date, you can take Witch Weekly. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Eric. That was wonderful. That was a great talk. Amazing.